friends, Caitlin here. I'm just here to show you a quick tutorial for making bias binding for specifically my modern half hexi pattern, but this would work for any quilts that have these convex and concave edges. So this is my modern half hexi pattern. And so you can see these are the angles that we are going to be binding, and you have to use bias binding to go around all these edges. So my favorite way to cut bias binding, you can cut bias binding off of your fabric, but I like cutting a square because it's less waste. And so this is the right size of square for the quilt that I am binding. So I'm just gonna first cut it in half on the diagonal. So I like to line my ruler up here on this 45-degree line, and then grab another ruler and just butt it up against there and make sure that it hits that other corner here, and then we'll just cut this. So now that I have my square cut in half, what I like to do is just grab the top triangle and just pull it straight down. And then this is the seam that we need to sew together. So I just flip that up, and then I overlap it about 1/4 of an inch on each side, dog ear these corners, and then I'm going to take it to my machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam here, and then press my seam open. Okay, so now I have taken this, I've sewn it, I press my seam open, and I'm ready to cut my bias strips off of this parallelogram. I like to make sure that this seam is diagonal to my body, and then I flip up these two tails of my parallelogram and fold them down and even up this edge here. And then I know I'm cutting my binding strips off of it this way. So your seam is always diagonal to the strip that you're cutting. I prefer to do 2 1/4 inch binding strips when I bind my quilt. So I am just going to, I cleaned up the one edge, and now I'm going to cut 2 1/4 inch binding strips for my bias binding. All right, so now that I have my strips cut, I'm going to take them to my sewing machine, and I'm just going to sew them together. So I just always line up these edges like this, flip them right sides together, and then you always want to dog ear them or overlap them by 1/4 of an inch. The nice thing with these bias bindings is they're already on the diagonal, so then your seam ends up being joined that way, which is the best way to join your binding seams. So then when you fold it, your seam is dispersed through the fold rather than having the bulk of a straight across seam. All right, so I'm going to continue attaching these binding strips to each other. So you want to make sure that you are always sewing the right sides together. So make sure you watch where your seam is on these. So here's my seam. So this is the right side. Here's my seam here. So this is the right side. These are the sides I want together like this. So if you're more a visual person like me, I always have to figure out this is exactly where I'm sewing, and then I flip them right sides together and dog ear them 1/4 of an inch, and then I just take them to my sewing machine and attach all the binding strips together all at once. So now I'll just cut these threads, and I will go take this to my iron, press these seams open, and press my binding in half. And the reason I like to press my binding in half, especially for bias binding when sewing it onto a quilt, is bias binding is very stretchy, and it's very easy to get it off. So if you can see this, if you pull it too far down, it can like twist. And so then when you wrap it around, it will be all ripply. So if you just press it from the beginning directly in half, then it stays in place, and then you don't have to worry about getting any ripples in your bias binding strips. Okay, so now I have my binding pressed, and I like to roll my binding up so that it unrolls easily as I attach it to my quilt. I'm going to just start by sewing on one of the straight edges of this quilt, and then continue to do the edges this way. And I always leave a little bit of a tail so I can join my binding strips together at the end. All right, so when I get to my very first angle, very similar to a 45-degree angle of a quilt. It's just not as sharp of an angle. So you are going to create a miter tuck in your binding, just like you would a 45-degree angle. It's just, like I said, not as sharp. So I just laid my fabric up, gather up that extra fabric, fold it down, and then I'm going to stop sewing 1/4 of an inch away from this point. And then I just twist my quilt, sew off the edge. And then I'll flip that binding back that direction and then just sew straight across. Always backstitch whenever you start your binding. So now I have another angle. So again, just pull up a fold into your binding that matches the angle, 120-degree angle, and fold that fold down and then sew to 1/4 inch away. And then I'll fold that binding back and continue sewing. Okay, so now we're getting to the concave part of the binding. So what we're going to do is we're not going to be putting any tucks at all into the binding. So I like to just pull this tight, and you're going to stop sewing with your needle down right on that line where these two hexagons meet. And you're going to just pivot and keep sewing around this way without putting any tucks in your binding. I'm going to turn my needle down on my machine so that it ends that way. So then I can just turn my quilt and kind of pull this binding. And you want to avoid any tucks in your binding. So you just continue sewing around that curve. And then we're just going to keep doing our convex and concave corners around all the edges of the quilts to attach our binding. So now I'll just continue down the straight side of the quilt. And then we'll continue along the last bottom edge of this, these concave and convex edges of this quilt. All right, so now I'm going to stop here. I'm going to backtrack a little bit and show you how I like to join my ends of my binding. All right, so I meet these edges and then I finger press them into the center, and then I will take a pin and I will open this binding up and I'll stick a pin in that top crease and then straight over to where we made that crease in the binding. And then I'll do the same thing in the same direction for the other half of the binding in the top fold and then pin it to the left. So now I'll have these two that I need to meet, and we're going to cross that pin. So I like to just remember that I'm making a plus with my pins, and if you can fold that one binding out of the way, and then all of the lines will line up, right? The crease lines from that binding will line up here, and then we'll open up these, and these crease lines will line up on those on that fold as well. We're just going to open that up. And then I like to just pull these pins out and pin them diagonally through this way so that it kind of gives me a sewing channel so I know where I'm sewing. So now I'm going to just sew diagonally across from this point to this point. And you can see here, this is the center of those two bindings, and I'll use that as a reference as well for sewing. So now that I've got that sewn, I can take these pins out. And before you trim any of your fabric, you really want to check this angle and make sure that it lays flat. You can see there's all this extra fabric, but we'll trim that out. And sometimes at those angles, you can twist them or sew them the wrong way. So you always want to check that before you trim anything. But it looks really good, like it's going to line up perfectly. So I'm just going to open this back up and then trim 1/4 inch away from the edge of that seam. And then I'm going to finger press this binding open and lay that flat. And then I'm just going to continue sewing it down to attach the binding. So now I have all my binding attached, so I can just take this when you are going to finish the binding. You can check out my machine binding tutorial and see how I like to machine bind my binding this way. Or if you're going to hand bind, you can just do it exactly like that. You'll just fold these on and then you'll create your miters as you go in all of these mitered corners. You'll just flip them down and tuck them in, and then you will just do your hand stitching. And you can see here when you're doing your concave corners, there's no tucks at all in there, and that will just roll right over like that. And then you'll just continue doing your hand stitching. All right, that's it. That's what I have for you today. Thanks so much for watching.